Hello, and welcome back to Let's Play The Elder Scrolls III: Morrowind, Game of the Year Edition. Once again, it is story time because Fedar has found a few books here and there. Let's get started. Biography of the Wolf Queen by Qatar Ariphanes. Few historic figures are viewed as unambiguously evil, but Patima, the so-called Wolf Queen of Solitude, surely qualifies for that dishonor. Born to the imperial family in the 67th year of the Third Era, Patima was immediately presented to her grandfather, the Emperor Uriel Septim II, a famously kind-hearted man who viewed the solemn, intense babe and whispered, "She looks like a she-wolf about ready to pounce." Patima's childhood in the imperial city was certainly difficult from the start. Her father, Prince Pelagius Septim, and her mother, Kizara, showed little affection for their brood. Her eldest brother Antiochus, 16 at Patima's birth, was already a drunkard and womanizer, infamous in the Empire. Her younger brothers Sephirus and Magnus were born much later, so for years she was the only child in the imperial court. By the age of 14, Patima was a famous beauty with many suitors, but she was married to cement relations with King Mantiarco of the Nordic Kingdom of Solitude. She entered the court, it was said, as a pawn, but she quickly became a queen. The elderly King Mantiarco loved her and allowed her all the power she wished, which was total. When Uriel Septim II died the following year, her father was made emperor, and he faced a greatly depleted treasury thanks to his father's poor management. Pelagius II dismissed the Elder Council, forcing them to buy back their positions. In Third Era 97, after many miscarriages, the Queen of Solitude gave birth to a son, who she named Uriel after her grandfather. Mantiarco quickly made Uriel his heir, but the queen had much larger ambitions for her child. 2 years later, Pelagius II died, many say poisoned by a vengeful former council member, and his son, Patima's brother Antiochus, took the throne. At age 48, it could be said that Antiochus's wild seeds had yet to be sown, and the history books are nearly pornographic in their depictions of life at the imperial court during the years of his reign. Patima, whose passion was for power, not fornication, was scandalized every time she visited the imperial city. Mantiarco, King of Solitude, died the springtide after Pelagius II. Uriel ascended to the throne, ruling jointly with his mother. Doubtless, Uriel had the right and would have preferred to rule alone, but Patima convinced him that his position was only temporary. He would have the empire, not merely the kingdom. In Castle Solitude, she entertained dozens of diplomats from other kingdoms of Skyrim, sowing seeds of discontent. Her guest list over the years expanded to include kings and queens of High Rock and Morrowind as well. For 13 years, Antiochus ruled Tamriel and proved an able leader despite his moral laxity. Several historians point to proof that Patima cast the spell that ended her brother's life, but evidence one way or another is lost in the sands of time. In any event, both she and her son Uriel were visiting the imperial court in 3rd Year 112 when Antiochus died, and immediately challenged the rule of his daughter and heir, Kintyra. Patima's speech to the Elder Council is perhaps helpful to students of public speaking. She began with flattery and self-abasement. "My most august and wise friends, members of the Elder Council, I am but a provincial queen, and I can only assume to bring to issue what you yourselves must have already pondered." She continued on to praise the late emperor, who was a popular ruler in spite of his flaws. "He was a true septim and a great warrior, destroying, with your counsel, the near-invincible armada of Paiandania." But little time was wasted before she came to her point. "The Empress Magna, unfortunately, did nothing to temper my brother's lustful spirits. In point of fact, no whore in the slums of the city spread out on more beds than she. Had she attended to her duties in the imperial bedchamber more faithfully, we would have a true heir to the empire, not the half-wit milksop bastards who call themselves the emperor's children. The girl called Kintyra is popularly believed to be the daughter of Magna and the captain of the guard. It may be that she is the daughter of Magna and the boy who cleans the cistern. We can never know for certain. Not as certainly as we can know the lineage of my son, Uriel, the last of the Septim dynasty." Despite Patima's eloquence, the Elder Council allowed Kintyra to assume the throne as the Empress Kintyra II. Patima and Uriel angrily returned to Skyrim and began assembling the rebellion. Details of the War of the Red Diamond are included in other histories. We need not recount the Empress Kintyra II's capture and eventual execution in High Rock in the year 3rd Era 114, nor the ascension of Patima's son, Uriel III, 7 years later. Her surviving brothers, Severus and Magnus, fought the Emperor and his mother for years, tearing the empire apart in a civil war. When Uriel III fought his uncle Severus in Hammerfell at the Battle of Ickadog in 3rd Year 127, Patima was fighting her other brother, Uriel's uncle Magnus, in Skyrim at the Battle of Falkenstar. She received word of her son's defeat and capture just as she was preparing to mount an attack on Magnus's weakest flank. The 61-year-old Wolf Queen flew into a rage and led the assault herself. It was a success, and Magnus and his army fled. In the midst of the victory celebration, Patima heard the news that her son the Emperor had been killed by an angry mob before he had even made it for trial in the imperial city. He had been burned to death within his carriage. When Severus was proclaimed emperor, Patima's fury was terrible to behold. She summoned Daedra to fight for her, had her necromancers resurrect her fallen enemies as undead warriors, and mounted attack after attack on the forces of the Emperor Severus I. Her allies began leaving her as her madness grew, and her only companions were the zombies and skeletons she had amassed over the years. The Kingdom of Solitude became a land of death. Stories of the ancient Wolf Queen being waited on by rotting skeletal chambermaids and holding war plans with vampiric generals terrified her subjects. Patima died after a month-long siege on her castle in the year 3rd Era 137 at the age of 90. While she lived, she had been the Wolf Queen of Solitude, daughter of the Emperor Pelagius II, wife of King Mantiarco, aunt of the Empress Kintyre II, mother of Emperor Uriel III, and sister of the emperors Antiochus and Severus. 3 years after her death, Antiochus died, and his, and Patima's, brother Magnus took the throne. Her death has hardly diminished her notoriety. Though there is little direct evidence of this, some theologians maintain that her spirit was so strong she became a Daedra after her death, inspiring mortals to mad ambition and treason. It is also said that her madness so infused Castle Solitude that it infected the next king to rule there. Ironically, that was her 18-year-old nephew Pelagius, the son of Magnus. Whatever the truth of the legend, it is undeniable that when Pelagius left Solitude in 3rd Era 145 to assume the title of Emperor Pelagius III, he quickly became known as Pelagius the Mad. It is even widely rumored that he murdered his father Magnus. The Wolf Queen must surely have had the last laugh. Well, that's fun. The other books are in the Fighters Guild.
Oh, greetings.
Greetings
How
and
do
salutations.
You do? Maybe talk.
Because I've started splitting my inventory up between the two places.
What do you want?
How does the day greet you, friend?
Okay, let's see. Now, we've read that. In fact, we don't need any of those. They're all in here. Okay, that's good. Let's keep going. The 36 Lessons of Vivec, Sermon 15. These were the days of Resdania, when Chimer and Dwemer lived under the wise and benevolent rule of the Almsivi and their champion the Hortator. When the gods of Veloth would retreat unto their own, to mold the cosmos and other matters, the Hortator would at times become confused. Vivec would always be there to advise him, and this is the third of the 3 lessons of ruling kings. The ruling king will remove me, his maker. This is the way of all children. His greatest enemy is the Sharmat, who is the false dreamer. You or he is the Shingle Hortator. Beware the wrong walking path. Beware the crime of benevolence. Behold him by his words. I am the Sharmat. I am older than music. What I bring is light. What I bring is a star. What I bring is an ancient sea. When you sleep, you see me, dancing at the core. It is not a blight. It is my house. I put a star into the world's mouth to murder it. Tear down the pylons. My blind fish swim in the new phlogiston. Tear down the pylons. My deaf moons sing and burn and orbit me. I am older than music. What I bring is light. What I bring is a star. What I bring is an ancient sea. You alone, though you come again and again, can unmake him. Whether I allow it is within my wisdom. Go unarmed into his den with these words of power. e gartok padme kim e altidun. Or do not. The temporal myth is man. Reach heaven by violence. This magic I give to you. The world you will rule is only an intermittent hope, and you must be the letter written in uncertainty. The ending of the words is almsivi. I love how much sense those sermons make. What else? Yeah, this is next. A Dance in Fire, Chapter 4, by Woan Jarth. 18 Bosmeri and one Cyrodiilic former senior clerk for an Imperial Building Commission trudged through the jungle westward from the Xylo River to the ancient village of Vindizi. For Takuma's Scotty, the jungle was hostile, unfamiliar ground. The enormous vermiculated trees filled the bright morning with darkness and resembled nothing so much as grasping claws, bent on impeding their progress. Even the fronds of the low plants quivered with malevolent energy. What was worse, he was not alone in his anxiety. His fellow travelers, the natives who had survived the Khajiit attacks on the villages of Grenos and Athe, wore faces of undisguised fear. There was something sentient in the jungle, and not merely the mad but benevolent indigenous spirits. In his peripheral vision, Scotty could see the shadows of the Khajiit following the refugees, leaping from tree to tree. When he turned to face them, the lithe forms vanished into the gloom as if they had never been there. But he knew he had seen them, and the Bosmeri saw them too, and quickened their pace. After 18 hours, bitten raw by insects, scratched by 1,000 thorns, they emerged into a valley clearing. It was night, but a row of blazing torches greeted them, illuminating the leather-wrought tents and jumbled stones of the hamlet of Vindizi. At the end of the valley, the torches marked a sacred site, a gnarled bower of trees pressed closed together to form a temple. Wordlessly, the Bosmeri walked the torch arcade toward the trees. Scotty followed them. When they reached the solid mass of living wood with only one gaping portal, Scotty could see a dim blue light glowing within. A low, sonorous moan from 100 voices echoed within. The Bosmeri maiden he had been following held out her hand, stopping him. "You do not understand, but no outsider, not even a friend, may enter," she said. "This is a holy place." Scotty nodded and watched the refugees march into the temple, heads bowed. Their voices joined with the ones within. When the last wood elf had gone inside, Scotty turned his attention back to the village. There must be food to be had somewhere. A tendril of smoke and a faint whiff of roasting venison beyond the torchlight led him. They were 5 Cyrodiils, 2 Bretons, and a Nord. The group gathered around a campfire of glowing white stones, pulling steaming strips of meat from the cadaver of a great stag. At Scotty's approach, they rose up, all but the Nord, who was distracted by his hunk of animal flesh. "Good evening. Sorry to interrupt, but I was wondering if I might have a little something to eat. I'm afraid I'm rather hungry after walking all day with some refugees from Grenos and Athe." They bade him to sit down and eat, and introduced themselves. "So, the war's back on, it seems," said Scotty amiably. "Best thing for these effete do-nothings," replied the Nord in between bites. "I've never seen such a lazy culture. Now they've got the Khajiit striking them on land, and the High Elves at sea. If there's any province that deserves a little distress, it's damnable Valenwood." "I don't see how they're so offensive to you," laughed one of the Bretons. "They're congenital thieves, even worse than the Khajiit because they are so blessed meek in their aggression." The Nord spat out a gob of fat which sizzled on the hot stones of the fire. "They spread their forests into territory that doesn't belong to them, slowly infiltrating their neighbors, and they're puzzled when elsewhere shoves back at them. They're all villains of the worst order." "What are you doing here?" asked Scotty. "I'm a diplomat from the court of Gehenna," muttered the Nord, returning to his food. "What about you? What are you doing here?" asked one of the Cyrodiils. "I work for Lord Atreus's building commission in the Imperial City," said Scotty. "One of my former colleagues suggested that I come down to Valenwood. He said the war was over, and I could contract a great deal of business for my firm rebuilding what was lost. One disaster after another, and I've lost all my money. I'm in the middle of a rekindling of war, and I cannot find my former colleague." "Your former colleague," murmured another of the Cyrodiils, who had introduced himself as Regulius. "He wasn't by any chance named Eliades Juris, was he?" "You know him?" "He lured me down to Valenwood in nearly the exact same circumstances," smiled Regulius grimly. "I worked for your employer's competitor, Lord Vanex's men, where Eliades Juris also formerly worked. He wrote to me, asking that I represent an Imperial building commission and contract some post-war construction. I had just been released from my employment, and I thought that if I brought some new business, I could have my job back. Juris and I met in Athe, and he said he was going to arrange a very lucrative meeting with the Sylvanar. Scotty was stunned. Where is he now? I'm no theologian, so I couldn't say, Reglius shrugged. He's dead. When the Khajiit attacked Athe, they began by torching the harbor where Juris was readying his boat. Or should I say, my boat, since it was purchased with the gold I brought. By the time we were even aware of what was happening enough to flee, everything by the water was ash. The Khajiit may be animals, but they know how to arrange an attack. I think they followed us through the jungle to Vindisi, said Scotty nervously. There was definitely a group of something jumping along the treetops. Probably one of the monkey folk, snorted the Nord. Nothing to be concerned about. When we first came to Vindisi and the Bosmerial entered that tree, they were furious, whispering something about unleashing an ancient terror on their enemies, the Breton shivered, remembering. They've been there ever since, for over a day and a half now. If you want something to be afraid of, that's the direction to look. The other Breton, who was a representative of the Daggerfall Mages Guild, was staring off into the darkness while his fellow provincial spoke. Maybe, but there's something in the jungle too, right on the edge of the village, looking in. More refugees, maybe? Asked Scotty, trying to keep the alarm out of his voice. Not unless they're traveling through the trees now, whispered the wizard. The Nord and one of the Cyrodiils grabbed a long tarp of wet leather and pulled it across the fire, instantly extinguishing it without so much as a sizzle. Now Scotty could see the intruders, their elliptical yellow eyes and long cruel blades catching the torchlight. He froze with fear, praying that he too was not so visible to them. He felt something bump against his back and gasped. Reglius's voice hissed from up above. Be quiet for Mara's sake and climb up here. Scotty grabbed hold of the knotted double vine that hung down from a tall tree at the edge of the dead campfire. He scrambled up it as quickly as he could, holding his breath lest any grunt of exertion escape him. At the top of the vine, high above the village, was an abandoned nest from some great bird in a trident-shaped branch. As soon as Scotty had pulled himself into the soft, fragrant straw, Reglius pulled up the vine. No one else was there, and when Scotty looked down, he could see no one below. No one, that is, except the Khajiit, slowly moving toward the glow of the temple tree. Thank you, whispered Scotty, deeply touched that a competitor had helped him. He turned away from the village and saw that the tree's upper branches brushed against the mossy rock walls that surrounded the valley below. How are you at climbing? You're mad, said Reglius under his breath. We should stay here until they leave. If they burn Vindisi like they did Athe and Grenos, we'll be dead sure as if we stayed on the ground. Scotty began the slow, careful climb up the tree, testing each branch. Can you see what they're doing? I can't really tell, Reglius stared down into the gloom. They're at the front of the temple. I think they also have... It looks like long ropes trailing off behind them, off into the pass. Scotty crawled onto the strongest branch that pointed toward the wet, rocky face of the cliff. It was not a far jump at all. So close, in fact, that he could smell the moisture and feel the coolness of the stone. But it was a jump nevertheless, and in his history as a clerk, he had never before leapt from a tree 100 feet off the ground to a sheer rock. He pictured in his mind's eye the shadows that had pursued him through the jungle from the heights above. How their legs coiled to spring, how their arms snapped forward in an elegant fluid motion to grasp. He leapt. His hands grappled for rock, but long thick cords of moss were more accessible. He held hard, but when he tried to plant his feet forward, they slipped up skyward. For a few seconds, he found himself upside down before he managed to pull himself into a more conventional position. There was a narrow outcropping jutting out of the cliff where he could stand and finally exhale. Reglius! 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 Scotty did not dare to call out. In a minute, there was a shaking of branches, and Lord Vanek's man emerged. First his satchel, then his head, then the rest of him. Scotty started to whisper something, but Reglius shook his head violently and pointed downward. One of the Khajiit was at the base of the tree, peering at the remains of the campfire. Reglius awkwardly tried to balance himself on the branch, but as strong as it was exceedingly difficult with only one free hand. Scotty cupped his palms and then pointed at the satchel. It seemed to pain Reglius to let it out of his grasp, but he relented and tossed it to Scotty. There was a small, almost invisible hole in the bag, and when Scotty caught it, a single gold coin dropped out. It rang as it bounced against the rock wall on the descent, a high, soft sound that seemed like the loudest alarm Scotty had ever heard. Then, many things happened very quickly. The Cathay Rot at the base of the tree looked up and gave a loud wail. The other Khajiit followed in chorus as the cat below crouched down and then sprung up into the lower branches. Reglius saw it below him, climbing up with impossible dexterity, and panicked. Even before he jumped, Scotty could tell that he was going to fall. With a cry, Reglius the clerk plunged to the ground, breaking his neck on impact. A flash of white fire erupted from every crevice of the temple, and the moan of the Bosmeri prayer changed into something terrible and otherworldly. The climbing Cathay Rot stopped and stared. "Kirgo," it gasped. "The wild hunt." It was as if a crack in reality had opened wide. A flood of horrific beasts, tentacled toads, insects of armor and spine, gelatinous serpents, vaporous beings with the face of gods, all poured forth from the great hollow tree, blind with fury. They tore the Khajiit in front of the temple to pieces. All the other cats fled for the jungle, but as they did so, they began pulling on the ropes they carried. In a few seconds' time, the entire village of Vindizi was boiling with the lunatic apparitions of the wild hunt. Over the babbling, barking, howling horde, Scotty heard the Cyrodiils in hiding cry out as they were devoured. The Nord too was found and eaten, and both Bretons. The wizard had turned himself invisible, but the swarm did not rely on their sight. The tree the Cathay Rot was in began to sway and rock from the impossible violence beneath it. Scotty looked at the Khajiit's fear-struck eyes and held out one of the cords of moss. The cat's face showed its pitiful gratitude as it leapt for the vine. It didn't have time to entirely replace that expression when Scotty pulled back the cord and watched it fall. The hunt consumed it to the bone before it struck the ground. Scotty's own jump up to the next outcropping of rock was immeasurably more successful. From there, he pulled himself to the top of the cliff and was able to look down into the chaos that had been the village of Vindizi. The hunt's mass had grown and began to spill out through the pass out of the valley, pursuing the fleeing Khajiit. It was then that the madness truly began. In the moon's light, from Scotty's vantage, he could see where the Khajiit had attached their ropes. With a thunderous boom, an avalanche of boulders poured over the pass. When the dust cleared, he saw that the valley had been sealed. The wild hunt had nowhere to turn but on itself. Scotty turned his head, unable to bear to look at the cannibalistic orgy. The night jungle stood before him, a web of wood. He slung Reglius's satchel over his shoulder and entered. And next, The Locked Room by Porbert Latumley. Yana was precisely the kind of student her mentor Arth Camus despised, the professional amateur. He enjoyed all the criminal types who were his usual pupils at the stronghold, from the common burglar to the more sophisticated blackmailers, children and young people with strong career ambitions which the art and science of lockpicking could facilitate. They were always interested in simple solutions, the easy way. But people like Yana were always looking for exceptions, possibilities, exotica. For pragmatists like Arth Camus, it was intensely vexing. The Redguard maiden would spend hours in front of a lock, prodding at it with her wires and picks, flirting with the key pins and driver pins, exploring the hull with a sort of casual fascination that no delinquent possesses. Long after her fellow students had opened their test locks and moved on, Yana was still playing with hers. The fact that she always opened it eventually, no matter how advanced a lock it was, irked Arth Camus even further. "You are making things much too difficult," he would roar, boxing her ears. "Speed is of the essence, not merely technical know-how. I swear that if I put the key to the lock right in front of you, you'd still never get around to opening it." Yana would bear Arth Camus' abuse philosophically. She had, after all, paid him in advance. Speed was doubtless an important factor for the picker trying to get somewhere he wasn't supposed to go with the city guard on patrol behind him, but Yana knew it wouldn't apply to her. She merely wanted the knowledge. Arth Camus did everything he could think of to encourage Yana to move faster. She seemed to perversely thrive on his physical and verbal blows, spending more and more time on each lock, learning its idiosyncrasies and personality. Finally, he could bear it no longer. Very late one afternoon, after Yana had dawdled over a perfectly ordinary lock, he grabbed the girl by her ear and dragged her to a room in the stronghold far from the other students, an area they had always been forbidden to visit. The room was completely barren, except for one large crate in the center. There were no windows and no other door except for the one leading in. Arth Camus slammed his student against the crate and closed the door behind her. There was a distinct click of the lock. "This is the test for my advanced students," he laughed behind the door. "See if you can escape." Yana smiled and began her usual slow process of massaging the lock, gaining information. After a few minutes had gone by, she heard Arth Camus' voice again call out from behind the door. "Perhaps I should mention that this is a test of speed. You see the crate behind you? It contains a vampire ancient who has been locked in here for many months. It is absolutely ravenous. In a few minutes' time, the sun will have completely set, and if you have not opened the door, you will be nothing but a bloodless husk." Yana considered only for a moment whether Arth Camus was joking or not. She knew he was an evil, horrible man, but to resort to murder to teach his pupil? The moment she heard a rustling in the crate, any doubts she had were erased. Ignoring all her usual explorations, she jammed her wire into the lock, thrust the pegs against the pressure plate, and shoved open the door. Arth Camus stood in the hallway beyond, laughing cruelly. "So, now you've learned the value of fast work." Yana fled from Arth Camus' stronghold, fighting back her tears. He was certain that she would never return to his tutelage, but he considered that he had taught her at last a very valuable lesson. When she did return the next morning, Arth Camus registered no surprise, but inside he was seething. "I'll be leaving shortly," she explained quietly, "but I believe I've developed a new type of lock, and I'd be grateful if you'd give me your opinion of it." Arth Camus shrugged and asked her to present her design. "I was wondering if I might use the vampire room and install the lock. I think it would be better if I demonstrated it." Arth Camus was dubious, but the prospect of the tiresome girl leaving at last put him in an excellent and even indulgent mood. He agreed to give her access to the room. For all morning and most of the afternoon, she worked near the slumbering vampire, removing the old lock and adding her new prototype. Finally, she asked her old master to take a look. He studied the lock with an expert eye and found little to be impressed with. "This is the first and only pick-proof lock," Yana explained. "The only way to open it is to have the right key." Arth Camus scoffed and let Yana close the door, shutting him in the room. The door clicked and he began to go to work. To his dismay, the lock was much more difficult than he thought it would be. He tried all his methods to force it, and found that he had to resort to his hated student's method of careful and thorough exploration. "I need to leave now," called Yana from the other side of the door. "I'm going to bring the city guard to the stronghold. I know that it's against the rules, but I really think it's for the welfare of the villagers not to have a hungry vampire on the loose. It's getting dark, and even though you aren't able to unlock the door, the vampire might be less proud about using the key to escape. Remember when you said, if I put the key to the lock right in front of you, you'd still never get around to opening it?" "Wait!" Arth Camus yelled back. "I'll use the key. Where is it? You forgot to give it to me." But there was no reply, only the sound of footfall disappearing down the corridor beyond the door. Arth Camus began to work harder on the lock, but his hands were shaking with fear. With no windows, it was impossible to tell how late it was getting to be. Were minutes that were flying by, or hours? He only knew that the vampire ancient would know. The tools could not stand very much twisting and tapping from Arth Camus' hysterical hands. The wires snapped in the keyhole, just like a student. Arth Camus screamed and pounded on the door, but he knew that no one could possibly hear him. It was while sucking in his breath to scream again, he heard the distinct creak of the crate opening behind him. The vampire ancient regarded the master locksmith with insane, hungry eyes and flew at him in a frenzy. Before Arth Camus died, he saw it. On a chain that had been placed around the vampire's neck while it had been sleeping was a key. And finally, a passage from the text of the Vagaries of Magicka. "But take care, lest power enfeeble the fundaments and curtail the flow through the congeries, except when functions be warranted. And safeguard that the congeries shall not be abused by prideful wizards, confident in their skill and blinded by their ambitions. In this, hold the ordering of the congeries among the oldest and most trusted of mages, and make secure this ordering through arcane codes and keys to confound even the most clever students. The restorals must be most carefully guarded, for how often have even the wise lusted to overreach their bodies and souls with vitality and mana? And also must the Magicka fountains be damped and banked, sanctioning their engendering only to the reconsecration of essential arcane engines and templates, and then only by common assent of the Council. Yeah, of course. I'm gonna put Sermon 15 back in here. But the rest of them, Fedar can hold on to because he's gonna sell them. Anyway, we just read Biography of the Wolf Queen, The 36 Lessons of Vivec, Sermon 15, A Dance in Fire, Chapter 4, The Locked Room, and The Vagaries of Magicka. Fedar will return to his usual troublemaking in the next video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.